On October 9, 1942, 20,000 feet above a jungle island called Guadalcanal, a 22-year-old American pilot named Marion Carl was fighting for his life. He was flying a Grumman F-4F Wildcat, a stubby, heavy, carrier-based fighter, and he was being hunted. His enemy was a Mitsubishi A6M0, a plane so light, so agile, it felt like it was from the future. It could turn inside the Wildcat's radius twice over. It could climb like a rocket. For the past year, the Zero had been a ghost, a phantom that owned the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. Marion Carl was an ace, but right now, he was just meat. The Zero was on his tail. He pushed his Wildcat into a dive. The heavy American plane gained speed, but the Zero stayed with him. He rolled hard, right? The Wildcat responded, but slowly. Like the P-38, it felt mushy. The Zero was already there, anticipating his move, its cannons winking. Carl's cockpit exploded. Shrapnel tore through his leg. His controls went dead. He was going down. He managed to bail out, landing in the shark-infested waters, saved only by a miracle. This was the reality of the air war in the Pacific. This was Guadalcanal. But just weeks later, another farm boy from South Dakota would climb into the same sky and change everything. It wasn't a war. It was a meat grinder, a place where American pilots were being fed, one by one, into the teeth of the Japanese war machine. The American press called the pilots there the Cactus Air Force. The pilots themselves called their base, Henderson Field, the graveyard. The problem wasn't just the Zero, it was the doctrine. The experts back in America, the engineers, had a simple solution. Never turn with a Zero. It was the same doctrine as the P-38 pilots. Use your speed, use your armor, dive, shoot, and run. But in the chaotic, swirling dogfights over Guadalcanal, that doctrine was getting men killed every single day. The Japanese pilots were veterans. They had fought over China, over Pearl Harbor. They knew their aircraft. They baited the Americans into turns. They knew the Wildcat was slow to respond. They knew exactly where to shoot. The Americans were losing, desperately. What the Cactus Air Force didn't know, what the veteran Japanese pilots couldn't possibly know, was that the solution was on its way. But it wasn't a new plane. It wasn't a new doctrine from Washington. It was a 27-year-old farmer, a man so unassuming he had been told he was too old to fly in combat. A man who had learned to shoot not from a military manual, but by hunting jackrabbits on the frozen plains of South Dakota. This is the story of Joseph J. Foss, and the simple, forgotten farmer's trick that made him America's ace of aces. To understand how a single farmer could terrorize the Japanese Air Force, you first have to understand the farm. Joe Foss was not a career soldier. He was born in 1915 on a remote, unelectrified farm near Sioux Falls, South Dakota. His childhood wasn't spent in classrooms. It was spent in the dirt, in the cold, and in the wind. This was the David versus Goliath story, just like Simo Häyhä. But Foss's Goliath wasn't just the enemy. It was life itself. The Great Depression hit South Dakota like an artillery barrage. The land dried up. The crops failed. The family had nothing. Foss's sisu, that Finnish grit, was built from necessity. He and his father would hunt to put food on the table. And this is where the secret modification begins. When a 12-year-old Joe Foss hunted jackrabbits, he didn't have a scope. He had an old shotgun, and one rule from his father: don't waste shells. A jackrabbit doesn't run in a straight line. It weaves, it darts, it reverses. To hit it, you couldn't aim at it. You had to aim where it was going to be. It's called deflection shooting. While other kids were learning math, Foss was calculating lead, windage, and speed. In his head, in a fraction of a second. He wasn't just a good shot. He was a predator. He understood the science of hitting a moving target. This was his iron. Sight. This was his piano wire. It was a farmer's eye that military manuals couldn't teach. But Foss didn't want to hunt rabbits. He wanted to fly. In 1933, his father took him to an air show. He saw a Marine Corps squadron flying biplanes. He was 18, and he was hooked. He told his father, "That's what I'm going to do." The path was impossible. He was a poor farm kid. He had no education. When his father was tragically killed by a downed power line, Joe, at 19, had to drop out of school to run the farm. He was trapped, but he had that sisu. He worked the farm by day and took night classes. It took him 6 years to get enough credits to enter college. He worked his way through, washing dishes, to get a pilot's license. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Joe Foss was 26 years old. He raced to enlist in the Navy, to be a pilot. He was rejected. He was too old. In 1941, the cutoff age for a fighter pilot was 25. They told him he could be a flight instructor, teach other kids how to fly. It was a devastating blow. It was the engineering officer telling McKenna the cables were within spec. It was the experts telling Simo Heiha to use a scope. The doctrine said he was unfit for combat. So, Foss did what McKenna did. He broke the rules. He found a loophole. He joined the Marine Corps Reserve. He became an instructor. And for 9 long months, he watched as 20-year-old kids he had trained were sent off to war. Foss was enraged. He hounded his superiors. He demanded combat. He wrote letters. He made noise. He was, in his own words, the loudest, most annoying instructor in the Navy. Finally, just to shut him up, they gave in. They sent him to advanced fighter training. He was assigned to a new squadron, VMF 121, and in October 1942, as Marion Carl was being shot out of the sky, 27-year-old Grandpa Joe Foss, the too-old farmer from South Dakota, was put on a transport ship. His destination, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The place he arrived at was not a military base. It was hell. The moment he stepped off the plane, the smell hit him. A thick, humid mix of engine oil, rotting jungle, and death. The runway was a pockmarked strip of dirt and gravel, carved out of the palm trees. The operations center was a wooden shack named the Pagoda. The pilot's quarters were mud-floored tents, and everywhere were the wrecks, dozens of F-4F Wildcats, P-39s, shoved to the side of the runway, their wings torn off, their engines shattered, their cockpits stained. This was the graveyard of the Cactus Air Force. Foss was assigned to his tent. He met the men he would be flying with. They weren't the fresh-faced kids he had trained. They were ghosts. Their faces were yellow with atabrine, the anti-malaria drug. Their eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. Their flight suits were stained with sweat and grease. They were veterans, but they were also hunted. Foss, the old man, the farmer, walked in. They looked at him. He was new meat. He was another body to replace the one they lost yesterday. Foss looked at his assigned plane, a Grumman F-4F Wildcat. It was the same plane Marion Carl was shot down in. It was heavy. It was slow. It was, by all accounts, a flying coffin against the zero. The squadron's executive officer, a man named Duke, gave Foss the standard briefing, the one that was getting them all killed. Never turn with a zero. Never. Joe Foss listened. He nodded. He understood the words. But he also understood something the doctrine had missed. He understood jackrabbits. The next morning, Foss would fly his first mission. He was heading straight into the kill zone. He was a farmer in a flying coffin, about to fight the most advanced fighter plane on Earth. And he was about to use a trick that wasn't in any manual. Joe Foss's first flight over Guadalcanal was not a training run. It was a trial by fire. He climbed to 15,000 feet, his eyes scanning the empty blue. The ghosts in his squadron had warned him. They come out of the sun. You never see them until they're shooting at you. Foss was leading his first patrol, and he felt blind. Then the radio crackled. "Bandits! 11 o'clock high!" Foss looked up. He saw them, a formation of Mitsubishi Zeros, diving. They were fast, faster than anything he had ever seen. He remembered his orders. Never turn. Dive and run! Foss shoved his stick forward, put his Wildcat into a screaming dive. His heavy plane accelerated. The Zeros followed. One of them opened fire. Tracers zipped past Foss's canopy, close enough to make him flinch. He kept diving, all the way to the jungle canopy, shaking the Zeros off his tail. He returned to Henderson Field, his hands shaking, not from fear, but from anger. The doctrine was wrong. He knew it. You couldn't win by running away. You could only survive. And Joe Foss hadn't come here to survive. He had come here to hunt. On October 13th, just days after his arrival, Foss was leading another patrol. This time, they ran into a group of Japanese bombers protected by Zeros. The dogfight began. It was chaos. Wildcats and Zeros twisting in the sky. Foss saw a Zero lock onto his wingman's tail. The Japanese pilot was closing in for the kill. The doctrine said Foss should dive away, find an easier target. The farmer's eye said something different. Foss rolled his Wildcat hard. He wasn't aiming at the Zero. He was aiming where the jackrabbit was going to be. He pulled the trigger. His 650 caliber machine guns roared to life. He fired a long 3-second burst, not at the enemy plane, but at a patch of empty blue sky 200 feet in front of it. It looked like a mistake, a wasted shot, but the Japanese pilot, focused on his own kill, didn't see Foss. He executed a perfect tight turn and flew directly into the stream of 50 caliber rounds. The Zero's wing simply came off. The plane vanished in a cloud of metal and fire. It was Foss's first kill. He had not outturned the Zero. He had not outrun it. He had outthought it. He had used the farmer's logic that the experts in Washington had forgotten. He landed at Henderson Field a different man. The ghosts gathered around him. He had his first kill. He told his crew chief, "This plane, it's a truck, but it's a tough truck, and it shoots straight." He told his fellow pilots, "Forget what they told you. Don't chase them. Lead them. Lead them until you think you're going to miss. Then lead them some more. They will fly right into it." This was the piano wire modification. This was the iron sight logic. It wasn't a physical change to the plane. It was a mental change. It was a farmer's confidence. The pilots listened. They were desperate. Their ace, Marion Carl, was still recovering. They needed a leader, and this 27-year-old farmer was the only one talking about hunting, not running. Foss took command of his flight of 8 Wildcats. They were a band of misfits, the cast-offs, the new arrivals. They didn't have a cool nickname, so the press, watching this old man lead his chaotic squadron, gave them one. They called them Foss's Flying Circus. And on October 16th, the circus went to work. Foss led his 8 planes straight into a formation of 32 Japanese aircraft. 32 to sit. 32 to 8. It was suicide, but Foss had a plan. He wasn't going to dogfight. He was going to use his farmer's logic. He ordered his flight to use the thatch weave, a new tactic where pilots flew in pairs, covering each other's tails. Foss dove in. He saw a Zero. He didn't turn. He pulled lead, fired. The Zero exploded. Another Zero dove on him. Foss's wingman, who was weaving with him, saw it. The wingman rolled over and shot the Zero off Foss's tail. The circus was a machine. In 10 minutes of brutal, swirling combat, Foss's flight of 8 shot down 5 Japanese planes. Foss himself got 2. the circus returned to base. With all 8 planes, the graveyard was suddenly winning. The numbers started to climb, and they climbed at a rate that nobody could believe. It was Simo Heiha's kill count all over again. October 18th, Foss shoots down 2 more. October 20th, he downs another. By October 23rd, just 10 days after his first kill, Joe Foss was an ace with 5 victories. October 25th, he shoots down 3 zeros in a single day. The old man, the farmer, was now the deadliest pilot on the island. He wasn't just a pilot. He was a leader. His flying circus was dominating the sky. But like Simo Heiha, this kind of success comes at a cost. The Japanese were now furious. They were losing planes at an impossible rate. Their veteran pilots were being shot down by wildcats. It didn't make sense. And the name they kept hearing in their radio intercepts was Foss. The Japanese high command began to notice, just like Stavka noticed Simo, just like Saburo Sakai noticed the P-38s. The enemy was adapting. They weren't just fighting wildcats anymore. They were hunting Foss's flying circus. The war became personal. On November 7th, Foss was leading his flight when they were jumped by an elite group of Japanese aces. The sky was filled with planes. Foss shot down 2 zeros. He was lining up a third when his plane was ripped apart by cannon fire from behind. His engine exploded, his cockpit filled with smoke. He was going down. He managed to bail out, his plane crashing into the jungle. He was rescued, shaken, but unharmed. Just 2 days later, he was back in the air. This time, he was chasing a Japanese float plane. He was so focused on the kill, he didn't see the Jake float plane's rear gunner. The gunner opened fire. The bullets shattered Foss's engine. For the second time in 3 days, his plane was dead. But this time, he wasn't over the jungle. He was over the ocean. He ditched his wildcat in the water. The plane hit the waves hard and sank in less than 30 seconds. Foss was alone, in the middle of the Pacific, 10 miles from land. He was in the slot, one of the most shark-infested waters on Earth. He floated in his life vest, the water turning cold. He had that sisu. He was a farmer. He was used to waiting. He was used to surviving. But then he saw them. Fins. Dozens of them. Sharks. They circled him. They bumped him. Foss, the man who hunted zeros, was now being hunted by something far older. He treaded water. He waited. He watched the fins get closer. He had no weapon, no radio, just his farmer's grit. For 4 hours he floated, surrounded. Just as the sun was setting, a canoe appeared. It was manned by native islanders, sent by an Australian coast watcher who had, by sheer luck, seen the plane go down. They paddled toward him, beating the water with their oars to scare the sharks away. They dragged the exhausted hypothermic pilot from the water. When they got him back to Henderson Field, he was a wreck. He was suffering from exposure. He had malaria. The doctors ordered him grounded. Joe Foss, the ace of aces, was put in a hospital bed. His flying circus had to fly without him. The Japanese believed he was dead. The ghost of Guadalcanal was finally gone. They were wrong. Joe Foss lay in that bed for 2 weeks, shaking with fever, thinking about only one thing. The jackrabbits were getting away. He recovered. He walked out of the hospital, climbed back into a new wildcat, and on November 30th, he went hunting again. He shot down another zero. The ghost was back, and he was angry. The Japanese threw everything they had at him. He kept coming. By January 15, 1943, Joe Foss's tally stood at 23. He was just 3 kills away from the all-time American record, a record set in World War I by the legendary Eddie Rickenbacker. Rickenbacker's record was 26 kills. It was a holy number, a number no pilot had ever touched. And now, a 27-year-old farmer from South Dakota, in a flying coffin, was about to break it. By January 1943, the name Joe Foss was a legend on Guadalcanal, but it was a legend written in exhaustion and fever. The too-old farmer, now 27, was a physical wreck. The malaria he contracted had returned with a vengeance. He was flying with a constant raging fever. His ground crew would watch him land, his wildcat riddled with bullet holes, and he would be shaking so violently from the chills that they would have to lift him, drenched in sweat, from the cockpit. He was fighting two wars, one in the sky against the Japanese, and one in his own blood against the malaria parasite, and he was winning both. His tally stood at 23, the all-time American record, set by the legendary World War I ace Eddie Rickenbacker, was 26. That number, 26, was more than a statistic. It was a mountain. It was the symbol of ultimate American victory in the air. For 2 decades, no pilot had even come close. And now, a half-delirious farm boy from South Dakota, flying a plane that was supposedly a flying coffin, was about to climb that mountain. January 15th, 1943. This was the day. Foss was sick, sicker than he'd ever been. The doctors had forbidden him from flying. He ignored them. He pulled himself into his cockpit, his head pounding. The word was out. A massive Tokyo Express, a huge Japanese naval convoy, was heading for the island, protected by a massive screen of fighters. Foss and his flying circus were sent up to intercept. The sky turned black with planes. It was the largest air battle Foss had ever seen. Zeros and Wildcats mixed in a chaotic, swirling melee. Foss, his vision blurred by fever, fell back on his instincts. He fell back on the farm. He saw a Zero locking onto a wingman. He didn't think. He reacted. He rolled his Wildcat, not at the Zero, but at the empty space where the jackrabbit was going to be. He fired. His .50 calibers ripped the empty air. The Zero, committing to its turn, flew directly into the wall of lead. The plane disintegrated. That was kill number 24. He scanned the battle. Another Zero was diving on a different group of Wildcats. Foss shoved his throttle forward, his engine screaming. He cut the Zero off. The Japanese pilot, seeing Foss, tried to out-turn him, the classic Zero tactic. Foss didn't take the bait. He performed a high-side pass, a maneuver he had perfected. He rolled over the top of the Zero, came down from its blind spot, and fired a single, perfect burst. The Zero's engine exploded. That was kill number 25. He had tied Rickenbacker. He was now, officially, a living legend. But he wasn't done. He saw another Japanese plane, a roof float-plane fighter, trying to escape the battle. Foss dove. The Roof-A pilot saw him coming and pulled into a desperate climbing turn. This was the ultimate test. The farmer's eye versus the veteran Japanese pilot. Foss didn't just follow. He calculated. He saw the roof's line of escape. He pushed his own plane's nose up, firing a long, arcing deflection shot that seemed to defy physics. The .50 caliber rounds traveled in a perfect line, meeting the exact point in the sky where the roof was trying to flee. The plane was hit directly in the cockpit. It fell, tumbling end over end into the Pacific. That was kill number 26. In a single afternoon, while shaking with malaria, Joe Foss had shot down 3 enemy planes. He had tied and then broken the unbeatable record. He landed his Wildcat at Henderson Field. The entire base was waiting. The graveyard had become a field of victory. The ghosts of the Cactus Air Force lifted their too-old farmer out of his cockpit and carried him on their shoulders. He was, without question, America's ace of aces. But what the pilots on Guadalcanal celebrated, the Japanese high command in Rabaul mourned. This is the Saburo Sakai moment. This is the Pavel's diary, the enemy reaction. For months, Japanese pilots had operated with supreme confidence. They were flying the A6M-0, a marvel of engineering. They were veterans. They knew the F-4F Wildcat was inferior. They had killed dozens of them. Their doctrine was simple. Force the Wildcat into a turn, get on its 6 o'clock, and kill it. Then, Foss's flying circus appeared. And suddenly, the doctrine stopped working. Veteran Japanese pilots would return to their carriers, their faces pale, their hands shaking. They told their intelligence officers stories that made no sense. They said they would dive on a Wildcat, expecting it to run. But it wouldn't. They said they would bait it into a turn. But it wouldn't follow. Instead, the American plane would do something strange. It would roll, or climb, or dive, seemingly at random, fire its guns at empty sky, and then, a second later, the Zero next to them would explode. They couldn't understand what was happening. They were being hunted by a farmer's logic they couldn't comprehend. Joe Foss had done exactly what Simo Heiha had done. He had taken away the enemy's every advantage. Simo made himself invisible by hiding his glint and his breath. Foss made his intentions invisible by never aiming at his target. The Japanese pilots were fighting a ghost. They were fighting an invisible modification that wasn't made of piano wire. It was forged in the brain of a South Dakota hunter. Foss had single-handedly broken their confidence. He had proven that the Zero was not, in fact, unbeatable. He had proven that the inferior Wildcat, in the hands of a pilot who understood the science of the jackrabbit, was the deadliest weapon in the sky. The Japanese aces, who used to hunt Wildcats for sport, were now hesitant. They were cautious. The Cactus Air Force was no longer the hunted. It was the hunter, and it all came down to one man, who had been told he was too old to fight. But this victory came at a terrible price. This is the cost. This is the explosive bullet that Simo Heiha faced. Foss's cost wasn't a single bullet. It was a slow, agonizing burnout. Days after breaking the record, Foss was grounded for good. The malaria had finally won. He was now so sick he couldn't stand. He was suffering recurring, debilitating fevers. He had lost over 30 pounds. The man who had faced down Zeros and sharks was being eaten alive from the inside. He didn't leave Guadalcanal in a victory parade. He was evacuated on a stretcher, a skeletal, yellow-skinned ghost, his body broken by the island he had helped save. He was flown to hospitals in the Pacific and then back to the United States. He was a national hero, but he was also an invalid. But Joe Foss had that sisu, that farmer's grit. He spent months in a naval hospital in San Diego, recovering, and it was there that the nation he had served finally recognized him. On May 18, 1943, Joe Foss, the farmer from South Dakota, stood in the White House. President Franklin D. Roosevelt placed the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award, around his neck. The citation praised his dauntless courage and his incomparable combat skill. But what was his true legacy? What was the ripple effect of his farmer's logic? It was hope. In 1942, America was losing the war. The Zero was a mythic monster. The Japanese were seen as unstoppable. Joe Foss, with his 26 kills in just 44 days, broke that myth. He proved that an American farm boy in an American plane could beat the best the enemy had. He didn't just write a new chapter in air combat. He wrote the entire manual on how to defeat the Zero. The deflection shooting and thatch weave tactics he perfected became the new doctrine for the entire Pacific Fleet. He had saved Guadalcanal, and in doing so, he had helped turn the tide of the entire war. And what happens to a man who becomes the ace of aces when the war is over? Unlike Sergeant McKenna, whose modification remained a secret, Foss's heroism was celebrated. But like Simoheha, the farmer, he never forgot where he came from. He didn't stay in the military. He went home to South Dakota. He used his fame not for himself, but for his people. He entered politics. He was elected to the South Dakota legislature, and in 1954, that same farmer who had been told he wasn't good enough was elected governor of South Dakota. He served his state just as he had served his country. He went on to become the first commissioner of the American Football League and a beloved national figure. But he was always, at his core, that man from the farm, the man who understood the simple, brutal logic of the hunt. That's how wars are truly won, not by experts or engineers who read from a manual, but by the individuals who see the flaw. James McKenna, the mechanic, saw a flaw in a P-38's control cable. He saw a 3 to 8 inch slack that meant death, and he fixed it with a 6-inch piece of piano wire. Simoheha, the farmer, saw a flaw in the sniper's doctrine. He saw that a high-tech scope glinted, and he fixed it by using his old, reliable iron sights. And Joe Foss, the farm boy, saw a flaw in his inferior plane. He saw that you couldn't outturn a zero, but you could outthink it, and he fixed it, not with a tool, but with the farmer's eye he had trained his entire life. These are the forgotten pages, the stories of the men who broke the rules. To win the war, Joe Foss died in 2003, at the age of 87. He was buried with full military honors, a hero to his nation, a legend to the Marine Corps, and a testament to the unbeatable sisu of the American farmer. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you're part of something special here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for keeping these stories alive. He was too small. In June of 1942, a 16-year-old boy, standing just 5'5" and weighing only 110 pounds, walked into a U.S. Marine recruiting office. The recruiter didn't even look up from his desk. He just laughed. The Navy? They rejected him as too small. The Army paratroopers? They told him to go home and grow up. This boy was a walking fatal flaw. He was the P-38 that couldn't turn. By every military standard, he was useless. But the recruiters had made a fatal mistake. They saw a boy. They didn't see the weapon that poverty had created. They didn't see the eyes of a hunter who had been keeping his family from starvation for 5 years. This boy's name was Audie Leon Murphy. And in 30 months, this too-small reject would become a one-man army, who would single-handedly destroy an entire German company by climbing onto a burning tank that was seconds from exploding. The story doesn't begin on the battlefield. It begins in the crushing poverty of the cotton fields of Hunt County, Texas. Audie was the 6th of 12 children. His father, an impoverished sharecropper, abandoned the family. His mother died of pneumonia just after Audie turned 16. Suddenly, this 110-pound boy was the head of the family, the only provider for his younger siblings. His primary tool? A .22 rifle. His motivation? Starvation. A neighbor later recalled Murphy's uncanny marksmanship. The boy could drop a running rabbit at 50 yards. With a rifle most people couldn't hit a barn with. Murphy's own words were colder. "If I don't hit what I shoot at, my family doesn't eat tonight." This wasn't practice. This was survival. Every bullet cost money the family didn't have. Every miss meant empty stomachs. Under that pressure, Audie Murphy didn't just learn to shoot. He learned to kill. He developed a shooter's eye, a cold efficiency. that would one day terrify German soldiers across 3 countries. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Murphy saw his chance. The Army meant steady pay, 3 meals a day, and money to send home. But he was still 16, still underweight. After being laughed out of every other office, he went to the regular Army infantry. The recruiter looked at the forged affidavit from his sister, claiming he was 18. He looked at the boy who looked more like 14. He sighed and stamped the papers. The U.S. Army had no idea what it had just done. It had just accepted a field modification that would save hundreds of American lives by breaking all the rules. Private First Class David Mouse McClure, who trained with Murphy, recalled, "We all thought he was a mascot. The drill sergeants rode him mercilessly, called him baby. But then they got to the rifle range. Those baby blue eyes went cold as winter. He never missed. Not once." In July 1943, Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, landed in Sicily. In the mountains, Murphy's hidden truth was finally unleashed. His rural upbringing meant he moved silently. He used terrain. He shot with deadly, cold accuracy. Near Palermo, his unit was pinned by a German machine gun. This was his first problem. The doctrine said, "Wait for support." Murphy's doctrine said, "My family doesn't eat." While the others took cover, Private Murphy, the 110-pound baby, used the terrain to work his way around the enemy position, alone. He eliminated the entire crew with grenades. Then, in a move that would define his career, he turned their own machine gun on the retreating forces. Captain Paul Harris recommended him for a Bronze Star, writing, "This soldier displays a natural aptitude for combat that is extraordinary." Extraordinary was an understatement. Audie Murphy had just discovered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was exceptionally good at killing. Sicily was just the beginning. The Italian campaign is where Murphy transformed from a good soldier into a walking nightmare for the Wehrmacht. At the Volturno River in October 1943, his squad was decimated by a German counterattack. Instead of retreating, Murphy grabbed a borrowed sniper rifle and held the position, single-handedly. 5 German soldiers killed at over 300 yards. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest medal in the Army. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a force. Staff Sergeant William Polson described Murphy's method. Murph didn't fight angry. That's what was terrifying about him. He fought cold, calculated, like he was doing arithmetic. See a German, eliminate the German. Move to the next German. No emotion, no hesitation, just deadly efficiency. Then came Anzio, the blood-soaked beachhead Churchill called the Wildcat. The problem? A German tank. The one thing infantry fears most. Murphy didn't just fire his bazooka. He crawled towards the tank, using the terrain, until he was at point-blank range. He destroyed the German tank completely. He was awarded his first Silver Star. He had survived Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and Rome. He'd been wounded. He'd been promoted to sergeant. The too small farm boy now had a reputation that preceded him. But in August 1944 came the test that changed everything. Near Montélimar, France, his platoon was ambushed. The problem? His lieutenant, his commander, was killed in the opening volley. The chain of command was broken. Sergeant Murphy didn't wait for orders. He became the order. He took command of the platoon. The situation was impossible. 18 Americans against a German company of over 100. For 2 hours, Sergeant Murphy held a critical crossroads. He directed his men, exposed himself to fire, and personally accounted for 15 enemy dead. He held the line. The Army, finally realizing what it had, gave him a battlefield commission. On October 14, 1944, the kid who was too small to enlist was now Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy. But combat has a price. By January 1945, Murphy was no longer the 16-year-old kid. He was 19, but he looked 40. He had seen almost every one of his original friends killed or wounded. He had personally killed over 100 enemy soldiers. And now, he faced the Kulmar Pocket. The Kulmar Pocket was the last piece of French soil the Wehrmacht controlled. Hitler had ordered it held at all costs, and he had sent his best, the 2nd Mountain Division. Elite troops, veterans of the brutal winters in Norway, transferred specifically for this offensive. For Company B, the situation wasn't desperate. It was over. Look at the mathematics. In 5 days of constant brutal fighting, Company B had lost 102 men. All officers, except Murphy, were killed or evacuated. From a full strength of 187 men, they were down to 40 effectives. Murphy himself was fighting with a fresh leg wound from shrapnel. He told no one. Private Anthony Abramsky described their condition. "We were finished. Done. Most of us hadn't slept in 3 days. Half the guys had frostbite. Our machine guns were freezing up. We tried to dig foxholes. The ground was like iron." January 26, 1945. The dawn was gray and bitter cold. Company B was strung out in a thin line along the edge of the Holtzwihr forest. In front of them, a mile of open frozen ground. They were, as Abramsky said, sitting ducks. Murphy had positioned his only anti-tank capability, 2 M10 tank destroyers. He had his 40 exhausted men, and he had a field telephone line to artillery. His only real hope. At 1 p.m., the German artillery barrage began. Tree bursts, shells exploding in the treetops, showering the frozen ground with a rain of deadly hot steel. It lasted 30 minutes. At 1:40 p.m., the attack came. Private First Class Donald Ekman was the first to see them. You could see the pennants on the antenna of the German tanks. 6 of them, and behind them, Jesus Christ. 250 infantry, all in white snow camouflage, moving across that field like ghosts. Murphy's first action was to call for artillery support, but artillery alone wouldn't stop this. The Germans were too spread out, too numerous, moving too fast. At 600 yards, the M10 tank destroyers opened fire. Their first shots missed. The crews were exhausted, their hands numb from the cold. The return fire from the German tanks was immediate and devastating. An 88mm shell struck the rear M10 squarely in the turret. It burst into flames. The crew scrambled out, running for the woods. The forward M10, trying to move, slid sideways into a drainage ditch. Its tracks couldn't find a grip on the frozen ground. Its crew abandoned it and retreated. It was 2:20 p.m. Both tank destroyers were out of action. The German infantry was now closing to within 200 yards. This was the breaking point, the moment the position would be overrun. This is when Lieutenant Murphy made the decision that would defy all logic. He ordered his remaining 40 men to fall back, to retreat to prepared positions deeper in the woods. "Fall back!" he yelled. But he himself didn't retreat. Instead, as his men ran for cover, Lieutenant Murphy ran forward. He ran through the artillery and machine gun fire. He ran towards the burning M10 tank destroyer. The vehicle was fully engulfed in flames at the rear. Black smoke poured from the hull. At any moment, the thousands of rounds of ammunition and 300 gallons of gasoline inside would explode, turning the vehicle into a massive, shredded bomb. Murphy didn't hesitate. He climbed onto the back of the burning, exploding tank destroyer and manned its 50-caliber machine gun. From this position, he was a perfect target. A single, silhouetted figure standing on top of a bomb, completely exposed to 250 rifles and 6 tanks. Private Abramsky watched from the woods. "I saw Lieutenant Murphy climb on top of the burning tank destroyer. It was the greatest display of guts and courage I have ever seen." The 50-caliber Browning is a devastating weapon. In Murphy's hands, it became an instrument of precise destruction. The hunter's eye from the Texas cotton fields took over. For the next hour, this 19-year-old, 110-pound boy became a one-man army. He wasn't just firing. He was calculating. He held the field telephone in one hand, calling in artillery strikes. He held the trigger of the 50 cal in the other. He created a wall of steel, Sergeant Elma Brawley observed from the wood's edge. The German infantrymen got within 10 yards of Lieutenant Murphy, who killed them in the drawers, in the meadows, in the woods. Wherever he saw them, the German forces, these elite mountain troops, found themselves in an impossible trap. Their tanks, which should have crushed the position in seconds, were now useless. They could not advance without their infantry, and their infantry was being systematically destroyed by a single unseen machine gun, firing from inside a cloud of black smoke. Technical Sergeant Morris Wald, watching from the battalion command post, testified, "Murphy's fire was incredibly effective. He wasn't just spraying bullets. Every burst was aimed. He was picking off German infantry like he was at a shooting gallery. I saw him cut down an entire squad that was trying to flank our position. The Germans tried everything. They hit the tank destroyer with shells. Shrapnel tore through Murphy's leg. His second wound of the day. He ignored it. He just kept firing. He just kept calling in artillery. At 3:10 p.m., after 40 minutes of continuous firing, the 50 caliber started to slow down. He was running out of ammunition. The Germans sensed it. They started to rush forward. Murphy grabbed his carbine and started picking them off one by one. The Germans were now just 10 yards away. This was the end. Murphy made his last, most desperate call. He ordered the artillery to fire directly on his own position. The forward observer, Lieutenant Walter Weisfenning, refused. He knew it would mean certain death. Murphy screamed into the phone, "I'm giving you a direct order. Fire on my position now." The first 105mm shells landed 50 yards away. The explosions threw frozen earth and shrapnel in all directions. The German infantry caught in the open were torn apart. But Murphy, exposed on top of the burning vehicle, was also in the impact zone. The combination of his direct fire and the artillery exploding all around him finally broke the German attack. The surviving infantry, perhaps 100 men, turned and ran. The tanks, now without any support, reversed course and withdrew. It was 3:20 p.m. After one impossible hour, the attack was over. Audie Murphy, his uniform scorched, his leg bleeding, finally climbed down from the M10. 10 minutes later, the tank destroyer exploded. He walked, calmly, back to the wood line where his men waited. According to Private Abramsky, he was scary calm. He asked if they had any casualties, made sure everyone was okay, then sat down, lit a cigarette, and asked for a status report. His hands weren't even shaking. On that day, Audie Murphy killed or wounded an estimated 50 German soldiers. He had, alone, stopped a combined arms assault by 250 elite troops and 6 tanks. He had saved his company from certain destruction, and he had just secured his name in history. The battlefield was devastating. German bodies lay scattered across the snow-covered fields. The elite 2nd Mountain Division, the veterans of Norway, were in full retreat, their officers unable to rally them for another assault. But perhaps the most shocking part of this story is the silence. In the decades after the war, historians searched the German military archives, the veteran organizations, the personal diaries, looking for the German account of that day. They found almost nothing, a near-complete absence of first-hand reports from the men who attacked Holtzwihr. This silence is the real proof of what Audie Murphy did. The German units involved suffered approximately 50 casualties from Murphy's actions alone. Many witnesses were eliminated. But more than that, the German war machine was built on pride and elite training. The 2nd Mountain Division had fought in Norway, Finland, and on the Eastern Front. They had seen everything. But they had never seen this. The idea that 250 of their best men supported by 6 tanks, were not just defeated, but humiliated by one 50-kilogram American boy standing on a burning tank. Was a tactical defeat so shameful they simply erased it. It was incomprehensible. It didn't fit their doctrine. It didn't fit their worldview. It was a fatal flaw in their own logic. The official German war diary for that day tells the lie. It reads, "Attack on American positions near Holzwihr repulsed with heavy casualties. Enemy resistance heavier than expected." Heavier than expected. Sioux was one man. They had met someone who was simply better at war than they were. And that recognition broke something fundamental in their warrior identity. Their tactical plan was perfect. Their equipment was superior. Their soldiers were elite. And one farm boy, with a stupid idea, had broken all of it. The hunter had become the hunted. Murphy's stand had consequences far beyond the immediate tactical victory. This wasn't just about saving Company B. This was the big impact. The successful defense of the Badiedvir forest, the position Murphy refused to give up, broke the back of German resistance in all of Alsace. The German failure to break through meant the Kulmar Pocket's days were numbered. Holzwihr itself, the village they were trying to defend, fell to the Allies the very next day. Within weeks, the entire German bridgehead west of the Rhine had been eliminated, removing 50,000 German troops from the war and freeing Allied forces for the final assault into Germany. The too small farm boy had just changed the map of the war. On June 2, 1945, near Salzburg, Austria, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch formally presented 2nd Lieutenant Audie Murphy with the nation's highest military honor, the Medal of Honor. The official citation, typically understated in military documents, struggles to capture the reality of that day. It reads, "He was alone and exposed to German fire from 3 sides, but his deadly fire killed dozens of Germans and caused their infantry attack to waver. For an hour, the Germans tried every available weapon to eliminate 2nd Lieutenant Murphy, but he continued to hold his position." Murphy's own words were, as always, more direct. When asked why he had climbed onto the burning tank destroyer, why he had performed that stupid action, his response was simple. "They were killing my friends." He later said, "It was not a heroic act. I figured if one man could do the job, why risk the lives of others?" This was the McKenna mindset, the piano wire fix. It wasn't about glory. It was about seeing a fatal problem and finding a solution. Right now, his military record remains unmatched by any American soldier. He received every combat decoration for valor that the United States Army could award, some of them twice. His 33 decorations included the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, the Legion of Merit, 2 Bronze Stars, and 3 Purple Hearts. He also received 5 decorations from France and Belgium. The boy who was too small to be a Marine had become the most decorated American soldier of World War II. 2. The war in Europe ended. The guns fell silent. Audie Murphy came home. He was a national hero. He was on the cover of Life magazine. He was given parades. He was invited to Hollywood. He became a movie star, starring in over 40 films, including To Hell and Back, where he played himself. To the public, this was the perfect Hollywood ending. The ultimate rags-to-riches story. The poor Texas farm boy had defeated the Nazis and become a rich and famous star. But this is not where Audie Murphy's story ends. This is where the real war, the missing page, begins. The public saw Audie Murphy, the hero. They did not see the fatal flaw that the war had left inside him. The man who had shown no fear on top of a burning tank was now terrified of the dark. Murphy's post-war struggle with what was then called battle fatigue, we now know as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He suffered from chronic insomnia, recurring nightmares, and a hypervigilance that led him to sleep with a loaded pistol under his pillow. He was haunted. He wasn't haunted by the men he killed. He was haunted by the men he couldn't save. He was haunted by the faces of his friends. He had survived, but he had never truly left that battlefield. Eventually, he couldn't even sleep in the house. He moved to his garage, where he slept with the lights on, because the darkness reminded him of night patrols. "I can't remember when I didn't have nightmares," Murphy wrote. "They became part of my life, like breathing. A demon seemed to have entered my body." His first marriage, to the actress Wanda Hendricks, lasted only 16 months. It was destroyed by his PTSD. Hendricks later described he was two people. During the day, he could be charming, funny, generous. But at night, he became someone else. He'd patrol the house with a loaded gun, reliving battles from years earlier. The war had ended for America, but it had never ended for Audie Murphy. He was fighting a new enemy, an invisible one, and it was an enemy he couldn't defeat with a rifle. Despite his own struggles, Murphy became one of the first, and most important, public advocates for veterans' mental health. In the 1960s, he broke through regulations. He spoke publicly about his nightmares, his insomnia, his demons. This was the stupid action of the post-war era. In a time when battle fatigue was seen as weakness or cowardice, America's greatest hero stood up and said, "I have it." He was, once again, the man on the front line, seeing the problem the engineers and politicians were ignoring. He wrote for the Saturday Evening Post, "What about the veteran who can't? What about the thousands coming back from Vietnam with the same problems?" He was no longer fighting for Company B. He was fighting for all veterans. But this time, he wasn't alone. In 1951, he married Pamela Archer. And this is the other missing page of the Audie Murphy legend. This is the other hero of this story. Pamela was a 31-year-old former airline stewardess, and she saw the two men inside Audie, the hero and the demon. And unlike everyone else, she did not run. Pamela Murphy provided the unique insight that the public never saw. Audie carried invisible wounds that never healed. He'd wake up screaming, reliving battles from 20 years earlier. But he never stopped trying to help other veterans. The war never ended for Audie, but he turned his pain into purpose. For 20 years, Pamela stood by him. She was his anchor, his field modification against the chaos in his own mind. She helped him raise 2 sons. She endured the nightmares. She supported his advocacy. She was the crew chief for the hero who was still at war. Then, on May 28, 1971, the impossible happened. Audie Murphy, the man who had survived every conceivable horror of war, the man whose statistics said should have died 20 times over on that burning tank, died at age 45, not in battle, but in a private plane crash in the mountains of Virginia, during a storm. America mourned its greatest hero. But for Pamela Murphy, the real mission was just beginning. Audie had spent his life fighting for his friends. Now, Pamela would spend the rest of her life fighting for his. She had seen the fatal flaw of PTSD up close for 20 years, and now she was going to fix it. After Audie's death in 1971, the world discovered another missing page. The most decorated soldier in American history. The man who became a Hollywood star, died in debt. Bad investments and mismanagement by others had left his estate, and his wife, Pamela, with almost nothing. She was a 50-year-old widow with 2 teenage sons to raise and a mountain of her late husband's debts. This was her Kulmar pocket. This was her impossible situation. The world expected her to fade away, a tragic footnote in a hero's story. But they forgot who she was. She was the woman who had stood by Audie Murphy for 20 years. She had faced his demons with him. She was a warrior in her own right. And now she had a new mission. Audie's war was over. Hers was just beginning. She did something that defied all expectation. She didn't write a tell-all book. She didn't sell his medals. Instead, Pamela Murphy, the widow of America's greatest hero, walked into the Sepulveda Veterans Affairs Hospital in Los Angeles and asked for a job. She didn't ask for a high-level position. She didn't use her famous name. She took a job as a simple clerk, a patient liaison. This was her piano wire fix. This was her climbing on the burning tank. For the next 35 years, Pamela Murphy dedicated her life to Audie's other war. She arrived at the hospital every morning, took her small desk, and became a one-woman army for the veterans nobody else would listen to. She was the mechanic who saw the fatal flaw in the system. She saw veterans shattered by Vietnam, suffering from the same battle fatigue that had haunted her husband. She saw them getting lost in the bureaucracy, their files misplaced, their benefits denied, their appointments canceled. These men were the ghosts of her husband, and Pamela Murphy would not abandon them. She became their advocate. She was the piano wire in the broken control cable of the VA system. She used her quiet dignity and the profound moral authority her name carried to cut through the red tape. When a doctor wouldn't see a veteran, she made the call. When a benefit check was lost in the mail, she found it. When a bureaucrat told a veteran no, Pamela Murphy was the one who walked into their office and did not leave until that no became a yes. She treated every single veteran, from the forgotten homeless soldier in the hallway to the decorated colonels, with the same respect. She saw her husband's face, his pain, his struggle, in every single one of them. She was Audie's final and most powerful field modification. She wasn't just preserving his memory. She was finishing his mission. The Audie L. Murphy Memorial VA Hospital in San Antonio, Texas, was named in his honor in 1973. But Pamela was his living memorial, a 35-year-long testament to the promise of leave no man behind. But that legacy, that 35-year mission, was only possible because of what happened on that frozen field. It leaves the one final question: how? How did one 110-pound, 19-year-old boy with shrapnel in his leg actually do it? It wasn't magic. It wasn't a movie. It was a perfect storm of 4 factors. The same factors that defined the piano wire fix: a brilliant mechanic, a fatal flaw, a stupid innovation, and a crazy result. The first factor was the weapon. The M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun, designed by John Browning in 1980 in Onhuadri, Tanitinant. It was arguably the finest heavy machine gun of the Second World War. Its 50 BMG cartridge could penetrate an inch of armor plate. Each round had the devastating energy to tear a human body apart. It was reliable. It didn't jam in the freezing cold. In the hands of a normal soldier, it was a terrifying weapon of suppression. But in the hands of Audie Murphy, it was a scalpel. He wasn't just spraying and praying. He was aiming. He was using the cold arithmetic he learned hunting rabbits in Hunt County. He was, as Sergeant Wald testified, picking them off like he was at a shooting gallery. One burst, one target. See a German, eliminate the German. The weapon was perfect, but the man using it was a master. The second factor was the stupid location, that burning M10 tank destroyer. To the Germans, it was a death trap, a bomb. To Murphy, it was the perfect McKenna solution. He understood the hidden truth of the machine. What Murphy knew, and the Germans didn't, was how it was burning. The M10 carried 300 gallons of diesel fuel and 51 rounds of 3-inch high-explosive ammunition stored in the hull. The German 88mm shell had struck the fuel, not the ammunition. The vehicle was a bomb, but the fuse was slow. More importantly, the thick black smoke from the diesel fire provided a perfect smoke screen. The Germans knew the fire was coming from the smoke, but they couldn't get a clear shot at the man inside it. Murphy was, essentially, fighting from inside a burning fortress that he knew could detonate at any second. It was the ultimate stupid action and it was tactical genius. The third factor was the force multiplier. This is the part everyone misses. Murphy wasn't just a one-man army. He was a one-man fire direction center. While firing the 50 cal with one hand, he was holding the field telephone to his ear with the other. He was calling in 105mm howitzer shells from his own artillery miles away. He was multiplying his firepower by 1,000. The Germans weren't just running from his machine gun. They were running from the sky, which was exploding all around them, directed by the man inside the smoke. This is what finally, and most desperately, led to his command. Fire on my position. He was willing to sacrifice himself to use his last and greatest weapon, the artillery, to finish the job. And the fourth and most important factor was the hunter. Military scientists have tried to calculate the odds. Given the 250 infantry, the 6 tanks, the machine guns, the mortars, it's estimated that over 10,000 rounds were fired at Murphy's position during that hour. Statistical models suggest he should have been hit 15 to 20 times. He was only hit once by shrapnel from an exploding shell. This wasn't just luck. This was the uncanny skill of the Texas rabbit hunter. He understood not being seen. He understood one shot, one kill. He had, as he said, become a killing machine. Dr. Dave Grossman, an expert on combat psychology, offered this analysis. Murphy represented a perfect storm. He had the technical skills from hunting, the motivation from poverty, the emotional detachment from early trauma, and most importantly, a protective instinct for his men that overrode his own instinct for self-preservation. He wasn't fighting for America. He wasn't fighting for glory. He was fighting for his friends. That is the story of the stupid action that changed the war. The too small boy who was rejected by the Marines. The fatal flaw of a 110-pound kid who became the hidden weapon of the U.S. Army. The piano wire fix of climbing on a burning tank. That led to the crazy result of stopping an entire German army. His true legacy, the big impact, is twofold. The first is that he broke the stigma of PTSD. Because Audie Murphy said he had it, because America's greatest hero admitted he was haunted. Thousands of other veterans, for the first time, felt they could ask for help. He gave them the permission to be human. The second is Pamela Murphy. She worked at that VA hospital until she was 87 years old, finally retiring in 2007. She never remarried. When she died in 2010, she was buried next to him at Arlington National Cemetery. The mechanic reunited with her pilot. The world saw a hero. Pamela saw a man. The recruiters saw a fatal flaw. The Army found a secret weapon. The Germans saw an impossible situation. Audie Murphy saw a problem that needed fixing. It all comes back to that one fact. The one that makes this the greatest missing page of the war. The 110-pound farm boy, who was too small to be a soldier, became the man who stopped an army to save his friends. And in doing so, he and the wife who loved him saved thousands more long after the guns fell silent.